The finality of the oak door closing was a sound that echoed longer than the wood and iron that made it. It was the sound of a life ending. Ilara stood on the porch of the house she had shared with Thomas, the house his father had built, and felt the cold boards beneath her worn boots. In her hand were $3 and a folded deed, the paper brittle and thin against her palm. Inside Thomas's family, the Gables, were already partitioning her memory, dividing the life she and her husband had built as if it were mere furniture. Thomas had been gone 6 weeks, taken by a fever that burned through him like a prairie fire. His death had removed the single buffer between Ilara and his family's quiet disdain. She had been a trapper's daughter, not a founder's wife, a fact they had never let her forget. Now, with Thomas in the ground, their patience was exhausted. His brother, a man with a ledger for a heart, had explained it plainly. The main house, the good land, the livestock, it all belonged to the Gable bloodline. For her there was only what Thomas had owned before their marriage, a worthless, abandoned quarry 5 miles north of Providence Gulch. It was, he'd said with a thin smile, a gesture of profound charity. The deed was hers, free and clear. The $3 were for her journey, wherever that might lead. She was 24 years old. She had the clothes on her back, a wedding ring she refused to remove, and a deed to a hole in the ground. She walked into the center of town, the dust of the main street coating her hem. Providence Gulch was a town built on confidence, on the belief that hard work and good sense would always prevail. Her presence, a solitary woman with nothing, was a crack in that confidence. People watched her from the windows of the mercantile and the saloon. They saw a problem to be solved or a tragedy to be pitied from a safe distance. Mr. Gable, the town's most prominent merchant and Thomas's uncle, stepped out from his store. He was a man whose opinions were as solid and square as the tins of coffee stacked on his shelves. He looked at the deed in her hand, his expression a careful mixture of sorrow and pragmatism. "Ilara," he began, his voice low and reasonable, "this is no place for you. The quarry is a ruin. It's a pit of rattlers and stagnant water. Sell the deed for a pittance. Take the money and the silver you have and buy a stagecoach ticket east. Go back to your people." His words were meant to sound like kindness, but they were a dismissal. He was telling her to disappear, to take her failure elsewhere. The town nodded in agreement. It was the sensible thing to do. She was a woman alone. The mountains did not care for sensible plans. They simply devoured the unprepared. Ilara looked at his clean, untroubled hands, then down at her own, which were already calloused from a life of work. She thought of the journey east, of charity, of becoming a ghost in someone else's town. Then she thought of the quarry. It was hers, a ruin perhaps, a hole in the ground, but it was the only thing on earth that belonged to her. She folded the deed and tucked it into her pocket. She looked not at Gable, but past him, toward the jagged line of the northern hills. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "and a shovel." Gable sighed, a puff of exasperated air. He saw not resolve, but foolish pride. "Don't throw your last dollars away on a fool's errand, child." "I am not a child," she replied, and the simple truth of it silenced him. She walked into his mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her meager defiance. She bought the best axe head she could afford, a sturdy shovel, a length of rope, a sack of flour, and a block of salt. Her $3 silver were gone. When she walked back out, the town watched her go. They saw a woman walking toward her own grave. She did not look back. The journey to the quarry was a pilgrimage into isolation. The well-worn track leading from Providence Gulch dwindled into a deer trail, then nothing at all. The weight of the tools and the sack of flour was a constant biting presence, settling deep into her shoulders. With her was Flint, Thomas's lanky hound, a creature of silent loyalty who had followed her from the house without a command. He moved ahead of her, his nose to the ground, the only living thing that seemed to accept her path without judgment. The land grew harsher with every mile. The gentle rolling pastures around the town gave way to stony ground and twisted juniper. The air grew thinner, colder. She was climbing, leaving the world of men behind and entering the world of stone and wind. She walked for most of the day, stopping only to drink from a small creek, sharing her water with the dog. The silence was immense, broken only by the scrape of her boots on rock and the cry of a distant hawk. She found the quarry late in the afternoon, when the sun was throwing long, skeletal shadows across the landscape. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not merely a hole, it was a wound in the earth, a chaotic jumble of fractured limestone and red clay left to fester for 50 years. A section of the main cliff face had collapsed long ago, spilling a mountain of rubble onto the quarry floor. The pit was choked with thorny bushes and skeletal trees that had taken root in the debris. It smelled of damp rock and decay. This was her inheritance, a scar, a failure. Alara slid the sack and tools from her aching back and sank onto a large, flat stone at the quarry's edge. The sheer hopelessness of it washed over her like a physical wave. Gable had been right. The town had been right. This was a place of endings, not beginnings. What could she possibly build here? A house of broken rocks? A shelter of thorns? Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging, the first she had allowed herself since Thomas's funeral. Flint came to her side and nudged his head under her hand, a warm, solid presence in the vast emptiness. She sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the western ridge. The air grew cold with an astonishing speed. The warmth of the day was a fleeting memory, leached away by the stone. A deep, penetrating chill began to seep into her bones. This was the true enemy, she realized, not the rattlesnakes or the isolation. It was the cold, the relentless, killing cold of the high country winter that was only weeks away. Despair settled into a kind of numbness. She had to survive the night. She gathered dry brush and fallen branches, her hands clumsy with exhaustion, and built a small fire in the lee of a boulder. As the flames caught, she leaned back against the rock face, seeking any protection from the wind. And that is when she felt it. It was not warmth, not exactly. It was a lack of cold. The section of the cliff wall she rested against, the part that was still solid and uncollapsed, felt different from the loose rubble on the quarry floor. The surface stones she'd been sitting on were already icy to the touch, but this deep, vertical wall of limestone was neutral. It seemed to hold a deep, resonant stillness untouched by the plunging temperature of the air. Curiosity stirred through her exhaustion. She pressed her bare palm flat against the rock. It was cool, but it was a living cool, not the dead, biting cold of the other stones. It felt as though a deep, slow pulse of energy was dormant far within it. Geothermal heat, her father had called it. He had been a trapper who knew the mountains, who understood their secrets. He'd told her of caves that never froze, of springs that steamed in the dead of winter, warmed by the deep heart of the earth. She rose and began to walk along the base of the cliff, trailing her hand against the stone. The feeling persisted. This entire wall was a massive reservoir of stable temperature. It absorbed the sun's heat during the day and seemed to bleed it back out with infinitesimal slowness. It resisted the night's frost. It was a thermal mass on a colossal scale. Then she saw the second sign. Near the base of the wall, half hidden by a curtain of ancient dried moss, the rock was dark and damp. A thin, steady trickle of water, no thicker than a piece of yarn, emerged from a fissure and disappeared into the clay floor. She touched a finger to it, then brought it to her lips. It was clean, it was cold, and it was constant. A year-round spring protected from freezing by the same deep earth warmth that pulsed within the stone. She stood in the deepening dark, the small fire flickering at her feet. The quarry was still a ruin. Her task was still monumental, perhaps impossible. But it was no longer a grave. It was a foundation. The town saw a worthless hole. She saw a southern-facing wall that held the sun, a stone that held the heat, and water that ran in the deepest cold. She had shelter. She had warmth. She had water. She had a chance. The despair did not vanish, but it made room for a grim and powerful resolve. She picked up her axe. The work would begin at dawn. The first week was a battle against chaos. Ilara's world shrank to the quarry floor, to the contest between her muscles and the unyielding stone. Her first task was to clear a space at the base of the warm cliff wall. The collapse had left a tangled mess of rock slabs, some as small as loaves of bread, others the size of coffins. She had no draft animals, no block and tackle. She had only the shovel, a stout log for a lever, and the strength of her own body. Her hands, softened by her years as a wife in town, were raw by the end of the first day. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving angry red patches on her palms. She worked from the first light of dawn until her arms trembled with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a fever. She learned the language of leverage, the precise point to place her pry bar to shift a stone that she could never hope to lift. She learned to use gravity as an ally, rolling massive chunks of limestone down the slope of the rubble pile, slowly creating a level terrace against the rock face. Flint watched her, a silent observer, occasionally letting out a low growl at a dislodged snake or a scurrying rock chuck. She was not building a house, she was excavating a home. Her father had taught her that a man-made wall is always weaker than one made by the earth itself. The cliff face was her back wall, a perfect solid barrier against the northern winds. Her plan was to build 2 side walls extending out from the cliff, and a front wall to enclose the space, roofing it over with timber and sod. She would not be building on the land, she would be building into it. The stones she cleared became the material for her new walls. She chose the flattest, most stable pieces, dragging them into place one by one. The work was agonizingly slow. Each stone was a small victory. At night she would cook a meager meal of flour and water over her fire, her entire body screaming with a dull, throbbing ache. She would fall into a sleep that was less like rest and more like a temporary death, only to wake at dawn, stiff and sore, and begin again. The relentless physical labor burned away her grief, leaving only the sharp, clean focus of survival. She discovered a thick deposit of red clay at the bottom of the quarry, kept moist by the seep. She mixed it with dried grass and water to create a crude but effective mortar. It filled the gaps between her stones, sealing them against the wind. The walls rose with geological slowness, an inch or two a day. As they grew, they began to define a space, a small, 3-sided room, open to the sky but protected on 3 sides by the earth and her own labor. After 3 weeks of this solitary, brutal work, she knew she needed more. She needed a roof before the first snows, and she needed a way to sustain herself through the winter. She needed livestock. That meant a trip back to Providence Gulch. Her return to town was a spectacle. She was thinner, her face browned by the sun, her clothes stained with clay and sweat. Her hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a field worker, not a widow. When she walked into Gable's Mercantile, a hush fell over the customers. They stared at her as if she were an apparition. Gable leaned on his counter, his expression unreadable. "Back so soon?" he asked, a hint of smugness in his tone. "Decided the East was the better choice after all?" "I need 2 nanny goats," she said, ignoring his question, "and 4 laying hens, and a sharpening stone for my axe." A ripple of disbelief went through the store. Goats and chickens. For the quarry? It was madness. A man near the stove chuckled. "What you gonna keep 'em in, ma'am? A hole in the ground?" The men around him laughed. The sound was sharp and cruel. Ilara met Gable's eyes. Her gaze did not waver. "Do you have them, "Or not?" she asked. The money she had was not from charity. Before leaving, she had pulled the gold from her wedding ring, a small, painful sacrifice, and sold it to a traveling tinker for a handful of coins. It was all she had. Gable, ever the merchant, saw the glint of coin in her pouch. He led her to a pen behind the store. She chose her animals with a careful eye, a pair of hardy Alpine goats, already pregnant, and 4 healthy-looking hens. The price took nearly all her money. As the transaction was completed, Gable offered one last piece of advice. "The first blizzard will kill them all, you know. It's a waste." "I will not waste them," she said. She bought a small amount of grain with her last few pennies, tied the goats' leads together, and tucked the chickens into a burlap sack. Leading her small, noisy flock out of town, she could feel the eyes of Providence Gulch on her back. They were no longer pitying her. They were mocking her. The story of Quarry Alara and her foolish menagerie would be told over dinner tables that night. The journey back was even more difficult. The goats were stubborn, the chickens loud. But as she crested the final ridge and saw her quarry below, she felt a surge of pride. The low, sturdy stone walls looked like a natural extension of the cliff. It was not a house, not yet. But it was a beginning. It was hers. She built a small, secure pen for the animals within the walls of her structure, using the last of the cleared stones. They were sheltered from the wind, with the warmth of the cliff wall at their back. That night, the sound of their soft movements was a comfort against the immense silence. They were life. They were a future. Flint, who had been a quiet shadow, now found his purpose. He was a guardian. He slept across the open entrance to the structure, his ears twitching at every sound. He was her alarm, her protector, her only companion in the vast, lonely wilderness. The bond between them, forged in shared hardship, became unbreakable. She spoke to him as she worked, her thoughts spilling out into the quiet air, and his silent presence was her only answer. The roof was the final desperate challenge. She felled several dead, dry pines from the hills above the quarry, limbing them with her newly sharpened axe. The labor was immense, dragging the heavy logs down the slope and hoisting them into place across the top of her stone walls. She laid them close together, then covered them with a thick layer of pine boughs, and finally a heavy blanket of sod and clay dug from the quarry floor. The roof was low and thick, designed to bear the weight of snow and to insulate. Inside, the space was dark and cave-like. She left a small opening in the front wall for a door, a heavy frame of wood covered with a cured deer hide she had found left behind by a hunter. In the center of the room, she built a fire pit, lining it with flat stones. She had noticed a thin fissure running up the main cliff face, and with painstaking effort, she channeled the smoke from her fire pit toward it. The natural crack in the rock became her chimney, drawing the smoke up and away, venting it invisibly high above the quarry rim. The day she finished, a cold rain began to fall. She herded the animals inside, secured the hide flap door, and lit the first fire in her hearth. The smoke drew perfectly up the fissure. The stone walls, which had felt cool, began to drink in the heat. The geothermal warmth from the cliff and the radiant heat from the fire met and mingled, creating a deep, bone-soaking warmth that filled the small space. The goats chewed their cud peacefully. The chickens roosted on a low perch she had built. Flint lay by the fire, his tail thumping softly on the packed earth floor. Outside, the rain turned to sleet, and the wind howled over the quarry's edge. Inside, there was warmth, and the sound of breathing, and the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Ilara sat on a stone bench, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot water, and watched the flames. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a world. The town of Providence Gulch settled on a name for her. They called her the Barrow Wife. The name was whispered first in Gable's mercantile, then spoken openly in the street. It was a cruel name, conjuring images of a woman living in a grave, communing with the dead. It cast her as something unnatural, a creature of the cold earth, not a member of their community. The story of her foolishness became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of pride and straying from the fold. One afternoon, a trapper named Brant, a man known for his bluster, rode his horse to the rim of her quarry. He looked down at the low, sod-covered roof, barely visible against the landscape, and the thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the cliff face. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the rock walls. "Gable was right," he shouted down to her as she emerged from the hide-covered doorway. "You've buried yourself alive. That little hovel will be your tomb come the first big snow." Alara simply looked up at him, her expression calm, and then turned and went back inside, pulling the heavy flap closed behind her. Her silence was more infuriating to him than any argument. He rode away, shaking his head, eager to return to town and embellish the story of the mad barrow wife in her hole. She did not care. Their mockery was a distant noise, like the wind in the pines. Her world had shrunk to the rhythms of survival, a life dictated by the sun and the needs of her small flock. Her days took on a monastic routine. At dawn, she would rise in the gentle warmth of her shelter. The fire would have burned down to deep, glowing embers, but the stone walls held the heat, keeping the air from biting. She would milk the 2 goats, their warm milk hissing into her wooden bucket. She would feed the chickens their small ration of grain, her heart lifting at the sight of a new egg nestled in the straw. Her life was a closed, efficient system. The animals provided food, milk, cheese, and eggs. Their warmth contributed to the heat of the shelter. Their waste, mixed with soil, was spread over a small patch of earth she had painstakingly cleared inside the shelter, near the seep. In this subterranean garden, shielded from the frost, she planted a few precious seeds she had brought with her, tough, leafy greens that could grow in the low, indirect light that filtered through the doorway. Each day involved maintenance. She checked the roof for leaks, cleared the chimney fissure of any debris, and ensured her small stockpile of firewood remained dry. She spent hours exploring the surrounding hills, gathering fallen branches, her axe a constant companion. Flint was always with her, a silent, watchful guardian. The solitude was immense, but it was not lonely. It was a deep, resonant quiet, filled with the purpose of her work. She was the absolute sovereign of her small, functional world. The first test of her creation came not from snow, but from teeth. A pack of wolves, driven down from the high peaks by hunger, caught the scent of her goats. One night, their howls echoed through the quarry, a chilling chorus that spoke of raw, predatory hunger. Flint sprang to his feet, a low, rumbling growl in his chest, and stood alert at the door. Alara grabbed her axe and stood behind him, her heart pounding. The wolves circled the quarry rim, their dark shapes moving against the moonlit sky. They could smell the livestock, could feel the faint warmth rising, but they could not understand the source. Her shelter was a fortress of stone and earth. There were no wooden walls to claw through, no windows to break. The single entrance was a narrow opening, easily defended. The wolves howled in frustration for an hour, their calls growing more distant as they finally gave up and moved on in search of easier prey. She stood in the darkness long after they were gone, listening to the steady breathing of her animals. They were safe. Her design had worked. It was not a tomb. It was a sanctuary. The wolves had been a trial, a small rehearsal for the greater test she knew was coming. The winter winds were sharpening, and the sky to the north was taking on the color of slate. The real enemy was on its way. The great storm did not arrive with the fury of a blizzard. It came like a thief, quiet and insidious. It began as a cold, persistent rain in late November, a rain that fell from a sky the color of lead. But as the temperature dropped, the rain did not turn to snow, it turned to ice. It fell for 2 days and 2 nights, a relentless, freezing torrent that coated every surface in a clear, heavy sheath. The world outside Ilara's shelter was transformed into a beautiful and terrifying kingdom of glass. Every branch, every pine needle, every blade of grass was encased in a glistening armor. The sound of the wind was replaced by a constant, eerie creaking and groaning as the trees bore their impossible weight. Then came the cracking, sharp and sudden like rifle shots as massive limbs, then entire trees, shattered and fell to the ground. Inside her shelter, Ilara was largely untouched by the chaos. The thick sod roof, now sealed under a half-foot of solid ice, was stronger than ever. The seep continued its steady trickle. The fire in her hearth burned, its warmth held and radiated by the tons of limestone surrounding her. Her animals were calm, chewing their cud, oblivious to the war being waged on the world above. She felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were at the bottom of a deep frozen ocean, safe within her small bubble of life and warmth. In Providence Gulch, the ice storm was a catastrophe. The town had been built for snow, not this. The weight of the ice was a force their structures were not designed to withstand. The first thing to go were the barns. The long, unsupported roof spans, groaning under tons of accumulated ice, began to splinter and collapse. The sound of splintering timber was followed by the terrified cries of trapped and dying livestock. Mr. Gable's barn, the largest and proudest in the valley, was one of the first to fall. One of its main support beams snapped with a sound like a cannon blast, and the entire roof caved in, crushing half of his herd and trapping the rest in a freezing tomb of ice and splintered wood. Throughout the town the story was the same. Families huddled in their homes, listening to the destruction, their entire winter's supply of meat and milk being extinguished yard by yard. The cold that followed the storm was even more brutal. The sky cleared, but the temperature plummeted to depths no one could remember. The world was locked in a grip of absolute, motionless cold. In town, firewood supplies, already taxed, began to run dangerously low. The conventional log houses, with their drafty walls and inefficient fireplaces, bled heat into the frozen air. Frost crept in through the chinking, coating the inside walls. People burned furniture to stay alive. The confidence of Providence Gulch, its bedrock belief in its own resilience, shattered like ice under a hammer. They were isolated, their resources were failing, and the cold was relentless. They were facing a slow, freezing death, and they knew it. For Ilara, the deep freeze was just another phase of winter. Her world remained stable. The geothermal heat from the deep rock provided a constant, low-level warmth that kept the frost at bay. Her small, efficient fire needed only a modest amount of wood to keep the shelter comfortable. She had food, she had water. She had warmth. The storm had not been a fight for her. It had simply been weather. She was not fighting the winter. She was living within it, protected by the earth itself. The town had been wrong. Their way was wrong. The first sound was a frantic, muffled pounding. It was not the sound of a rockfall or a falling tree. It was the sound of a fist, weak but desperate, beating against the thick, ice-sheathed hide of her door. Flint was on his feet in an instant, not with a threatening growl, but with a series of short, questioning barks. He sensed no predator, only a desperate human. Ilara took her axe and used the blunt end to hammer at the thick crust of ice that had sealed the edges of her doorway. It took several hard blows before the seal cracked and she could pull the heavy flap inward. A figure stumbled and fell across her threshold, collapsing onto the earthen floor in a cloud of frozen breath. It was a boy no more than 15, his face pale and frost-bitten, his clothes frozen stiff. She dragged him inside, away from the biting wind, and pushed the door flap shut. She rolled him gently onto his back. It was Mr. Gable's son, Thomas's youngest cousin. He was barely conscious, his lips blue, his body shivering violently. She knew he was dangerously close to freezing to death. For a fleeting moment, The memory of the town's mockery, of Gable's smug condescension, flickered in her mind. They had cast her out, laughed at her endeavor, and left her for dead. Now the son of the man who led the chorus of scorn lay at her feet, begging for the life they had so casually dismissed. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, immediate human fact. A boy was freezing. She had warmth. She worked quickly, her actions born of a deep practical knowledge of survival. With a sharp knife, she cut away his frozen coat and boots. She stripped off his damp clothes and wrapped his frail body in the warmest goat hides she had. She propped him up near the fire, close enough to feel its life-giving heat, but not so close as to scald his numb skin. She warmed some goat's milk and patiently spooned the sweet, nourishing liquid between his chattering teeth. Slowly, color began to return to his cheeks. The violent shivering subsided into a tremor. His eyes, which had been glazed and unfocused, began to clear. He looked around the shelter, his gaze taking in the impossible scene, the gentle warmth, the peacefully resting animals, the small patch of green plants growing against the far wall, the neat stacks of firewood and supplies. His expression was one of profound, staggering disbelief. "The barns," he whispered, his voice a raw croak, "they all fell. The cattle. They're gone. We're burning the fences for firewood. My father, he sent me. He said, you were our only chance." He looked at her, his eyes wide with a question he couldn't articulate. How was this possible? How could this place, the town's greatest joke, be the only pocket of warmth and life left in a frozen world? Ilara simply placed another log on the fire. "Rest now," she said, her voice calm and even. "When you are stronger, you will eat." She had risked her own safety, breaking the ice seal of her shelter and letting the killing cold in, for the son of her chief tormentor. Her actions were the only answer he needed. The boy, whose name was Samuel, slept for hours, a deep, exhausted sleep. When he awoke, Ilara gave him a bowl of thick stew made from dried vegetables and a piece of hard cheese. He ate with the ravenous hunger of someone who had not known true warmth or a full belly in days. As he ate, he talked, his words spilling out in a rush of fear and awe. He described the collapsed roofs, the frozen livestock, the desperate huddling in the town meeting hall, which was itself now cracking under the strain. He looked around the shelter again, his eyes trying to comprehend its simple genius. He saw the stone walls, black with the soot of 1,000 fires, radiating a steady heat. He saw the animals, not just alive, but calm and healthy. He saw the impossible garden. "We called you the barrow wife," he said, his voice thick with shame. "We said you were living in a tomb." He looked at the gentle, life-filled space. "We were the ones living in tombs. We just didn't know it." Just before dusk, another figure appeared at the quarry's edge, a man moving slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. It was Mr. Gable. He had followed his son's tracks, fearing he would find a frozen body at the end of them. He peered down into the quarry, his face a mask of desperation. When he saw the wisp of smoke and the flicker of light from the open doorway, he half slid, half fell down the rubble-strewn slope. He appeared at the entrance, his fine wool coat torn and useless against the cold, his face gaunt with worry. He saw his son alive, wrapped in warm hides and sitting by a fire. Then his gaze swept over the rest of the shelter. He saw what his son had seen, not a hovel, not a grave, but a miracle of warmth and life. He saw the goats, the chickens, the impossible green of the garden. He saw the order, the planning, the quiet, unassailable competence of it all. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, stripped away by the cold and the loss. He looked at Ilara, this woman his family had discarded, this woman the whole town had mocked, and his face crumpled. The words came out, ragged and broken. "We were wrong," he said, the admission tearing from him. "My God, Ilara, we were all wrong. We called it Ilara's folly. We were the fools." He sank to his knees, his body trembling not just from the cold, but from the weight of his profound error. He had measured worth in acres and dollars, in the height of a barn's roof and the size of a herd. He had built on the surface, confident in the ways of men, and the first true test of nature had wiped it all away. She had built into the earth, respecting its power, and she had not just survived, she had thrived. Elara looked down at the broken man, the leader of the town that had scorned her. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." Vengeance was a luxury, a fire that consumed the one who held it. She had been focused on a different kind of fire, the one that gives life. She turned from him, ladled more stew into a second bowl, and held it out. Her voice was quiet, devoid of accusation. "There is food," she said. "Eat. Your son will need your strength to get back to his mother." In that simple act of grace, her victory was absolute. It was not a victory of being right, but a victory of character. She offered warmth to the man who had sent her into the cold, and food to the man who had predicted her starvation. She had built a shelter not just of stone and sod, but of a strength he could now, finally, begin to understand. When the great freeze finally broke, weeks later, the survivors of Providence Gulch emerged into a changed world. The town was a wreck, littered with the carcasses of livestock and the splintered remains of their proudest structures. They had survived, but their prosperity and their certainty were gone, frozen, and shattered by the ice. The story of what had happened at the quarry spread quickly, carried first by a humbled Mr. Gable and his son. At first, it was a trickle of visitors. A neighbor arrived, offering to trade precious firewood for a cup of fresh goat's milk for his sick child. A hunter came, offering a share of a kill in exchange for a dozen eggs. They came to her door not with mockery, but with a quiet, desperate respect. They saw what Gable had seen, the simple, undeniable proof of her wisdom. Elara traded freely. She shared what she had, her generosity stemming not from pity, but from a deep, quiet strength. She did not need their approval, but she would not deny their need. The nickname, the Barrow Wife, was never spoken again. In its place, people began to refer to her home simply as the shelter. The name held a reverence, a recognition of what it was, the one place that had held when all else had failed. Gable, using his influence in the territorial capital, had her deed officially redrawn, granting her ownership of the entire quarry and the surrounding 100 acres, a silent apology written in the language of legal ink. The impact on Providence Gulch was slow but profound. When the time came to rebuild, they did not build the same way. The new barns were lower, with steeply pitched roofs to shed ice and snow. Many were built like Elara's, dug into the south-facing slopes of hills, using the earth itself as insulation and a barrier against the wind. The principles she had demonstrated through necessity became the foundation of a new, more resilient architecture. They learned to work with the land, not just upon it. Elara never moved back to town. The quarry was her home, her creation, her world. She expanded it over the years, digging further into the cliff face, creating new rooms for storage, and a larger space for her growing flock of animals. Her shelter became a landmark, a place travelers were told to visit, to witness the work of the woman who had listened to the stone. Her story became a piece of regional lore, a tale of a discarded woman who had built a life from a place of ruin, a testament to the idea that the things we throw away often hold the most value. Years later, an older Elara would stand at the entrance of her home, watching the evening sun paint the western sky. At her side would be another dog, a descendant of the loyal Flint. She would look out over the quiet quarry, now green with the gardens she had cultivated, and feel a deep and abiding peace. She had been given nothing and had built everything. She had faced scorn and had answered with grace. She had created not just a shelter to survive the winter, but a legacy that would warm generations to come, a quiet monument to the enduring strength found not in defiance, but in resilience.